All right. Hi, welcome everyone to Mediations. Just a reminder, as this is an instructional space for those in the physical room with us, I encourage you to remain masked when not eating the lovely snacks, or generally whenever is possible. My name is Effie, as most of you know, and I am the person who sends you all the emails. I will be your host today. This talk is a hybrid version with some audience members on Zoom. It will be recorded with the speaker's permission and shared on both our YouTube page and our Facebook page. Our colleague, Billy Anderson, she recently shared with me an access check that she runs in her tutorial space. And so leaning on Billy's teaching methods, I wanted to remind you that access is a shared responsibility of everyone in the space, both in person and virtually. If there's anything we can do to make mediations as a physical space and as a community event more accessible, please do not hesitate to reach out to the committee. We'll begin with a land acknowledgement. The current practice of acknowledgements on university campuses are an attempt to recognize and show respect for the historical and current realities of the land and its Indigenous stewards. These acknowledgements serve as a constant reminder and a consistent pressure to include these communities in discussions about the lands for which they are the true stewards. Land acknowledgements are a time to consider our individual and collective roles in building relationships with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and our responsibilities to the land. To be meaningful and respectful, a land acknowledgement needs to be intentional. This is a time to give thanks, to consider our role in the stewardship of this earth, and our role in building relationships with Indigenous peoples and communities. Thus, we wish to acknowledge the Indigenous people who were the caretakers of this land long before it was stolen, and the road to truth and reconciliation that still lays ahead. We acknowledge that Western University is located on sacred land upon which we are privileged to work. We acknowledge these traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Chinantun nations on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. With this, we respect long-standing relationships that Indigenous nations have to this land. We acknowledge historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous peoples endure in Canada, and we accept responsibility as a public institution to contribute toward revealing and correcting miseducation, as well as renewing respectful relationships with Indigenous communities through our teaching, our research, and our community service. Thank you for your attentiveness during the land acknowledgement. And now, with great pleasure, I'll introduce our speaker. Avery Page is a PhD student in media studies, researching television production and the representation of Jewish women on American sitcoms. She holds a master's degree in television, radio, and film from Syracuse University and previously worked in television development and production. Today's talk is titled Imagined Audiences, Connecting the History and Theory of American Entertainment Television Production Studies, and the debates surrounding postfeminism. Take it away, Avery.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Effie, and thanks to everyone for coming. I did not expect this many people to attend in person, so that's very exciting. So today I'm, as Effie said, presenting my field exam project. So I decided to approach this as a pretty traditional essay because I wanted to really explore a lot of the key themes and scholarship that make up the history and theory of American entertainment television production studies, and the debate surrounding post-feminism. So after working through each of these fields, I then explored their intersections and connections. And I came to find that television has really come to pursue a particularly post-feminist audience. And I found that a lot of the exclusions or inclusions of identity on screen and on television have been calculated often according to these broader political economic logics of the television industry. And we see production practices shift according to these contexts throughout history. So the fields I chose can be quite broad. So I wanted to adopt two main frameworks to provide more of a narrow and coherent focus to my discussion. So the first lens I chose was, of course, the American sitcom. Not only is this where my research interests lay, but the sitcom has actually predated television from radio. It's the most durable genre throughout the entire history of television. And because of that, it's a really worthwhile lens to assess continuity and change, not only through the television industry, but of society. I also take on an intersectional framework. So my larger research interests are revolving around the representation of the Jewish woman on sitcoms. So this, of course, reflects not only issues of Jewish ethnicity, but also gender. So it's necessary for me to account for the ways that these categories of identity not only impact one another, but how they intersect with other categories like sexuality, class, and more to form these unique subjectivities and experiences. And I always understand categories of identity as historically specific and look at the ways that they might shift and change throughout time. So in my approach to the history and theory of American entertainment television, I mostly looked at the areas of policy and tech innovation that shaped the medium, the shifting industrial practices of the broadcasting industry, and finally, the ideological function of the medium throughout its history. For me, in any discussion of the medium, it's necessary to articulate each of these processes as inseparable, as well as more such as production that I will get into in my second field. So this is a very kind of Cliff Notes overview of this history. Obviously, we could be here all day, but I began my overview of the policy and tech innovation by looking at the introduction of television into American society. So the first successful television system debuted at the 1939 World Fair, which was in New York. So while this tech was available, it wouldn't launch into the public until 1941, when the FCC would approve commercial standards, meaning that from the outset, television would only be available to the public once it could rely on the sale of advertising for revenue. So during World War II, most of television programming and production was suspended, but coming out of the war, there was hundreds of new licenses for broadcasting. This unexpected immediate growth of the medium presented a lot of different issues, and the FCC decided to issue a freeze on the further allocation of these broadcast licenses. This freeze wouldn't lift until 1952, when the FCC finally landed on a system that would support mostly 3 healthy broadcast networks. So this cemented a very long-standing oligopoly between NBC, CBS, and ABC. So NBC, CBS, and ABC began networking. So how they did this is they purchased owned and operated stations, and they established long-term affiliation agreements across the nation with independently owned stations. So through this system, they could broadcast programming to a mass nationwide audience, in turn earn high advertising revenue, which would recoup the cost of production and operation. With this, independent operators simply could not operate with this scale. A lot of very early television was produced entirely by single sponsors. So for example, Texaco Star Theater or Colgate Comedy Hour. By 1954, the networks wanted to take much more control over their programming, and they shifted to a magazine concept of advertising. So what this meant was multiple advertisers, instead of just one, would purchase ad spots throughout a show, and they would embed 15 or 30-second commercials at regular intervals. So this is the model that we're familiar with on broadcast and cable today. Now, advertisers were actually pretty happy about this because they no longer had to be financially responsible for covering the cost of an entire TV series, and they could spread their ad spots across a variety of programming and reach maximum audience. So, of course, Hollywood then took over this programming, and Hollywood came to provide almost all television programming by the end of the 1950s. So how this would work is studios would license this content. Networks would license content from studios to show. So this is the system that stayed in place for decades, really until the 1980s, the early 80s, when neoliberal deregulatory policy opened up the market. So the first major shift was that cable television, which had been previously restricted, was now permitted to enter all US markets and distribute its own content. So this opened up the market beyond the 3 networks to all these new specialty stations, which catered to these niche tastes of demographically specific groups. So for example, ESPN showed sports, MTV showed content for teens, Nickelodeon showed content for children, and so on. So for a basic monthly fee, subscribers could get basic cable, which was supported by advertising, or for an additional fee, you could get a premium specialty channel like HBO, which offered content with no ads. So because cable also had to carry any existing stations in their market, a lot of independent stations, which previously people might not have been able to pick up, were now broadcast really clearly into homes. So Rupert Murdoch took advantage of this. He bought up a bunch of these now strong independent stations and made the first new broadcast network, Fox. So now this marketplace is more dynamic. It's really opened up. But by the 90s, neoliberalism had advocated for mergers, acquisitions, consolidation, all of this stuff. And out of this, these huge global conglomerates emerged with broadcast networks, cable, production studios, film, and more, all under common ownership. So the market competition is effectively quite stifled under this logic. So moving on to ideology. So it was really around 1955 was when television had come to be installed in 2/3 of all American homes. So this was post-war America. We saw men returning from war, families reassembling into these nuclear units. There was economic boom. People were purchasing homes in these newly developed suburban communities. So this was a very new way of life, and television quickly emerged as a way to transition Americans into this. So early sitcoms, I'm talking during the 40s and early 50s, were very urban, ethnic, and working class. And these especially helped negotiate this transition from depression and wartime era economics. So during those times, Americans often lived multi-generation under one roof in urban, tight-knit ethnic communities. Then post-war, everyone was shifting into this suburban culture of consumerism, which was very different. So through shows like The Goldbergs or The Honeymooners, we see these urban ethnic experiences of the past infused with consumerism in order to legitimize this new way of life. Now, by the end of the 50s, these shows were becoming really unfamiliar, especially to rural and Midwestern audiences who were now at large accessing television. So those kinds of sitcoms fell out of favor to stories that were really about this suburban nuclear family. So shows like Leave It to Beaver or The Donna Reed Show. And these new shows helped to naturalize American life that was one that was unquestioningly patriarchal, white, Protestant, conservative, and middle class. Into the 60s, a lot of us might think of US as a country where there was a lot of countercultural stuff going on, social turbulence, but really the sitcoms of this decade did not address any of this. Instead, there was a lot of these weird supernatural shows like The Addams Family or Bewitched, and these shows often infused the previous suburban family sitcoms with elements of science fiction or fantasy. There was also a lot of rural sitcoms like The Beverly Hillbillies, Green Acres, shows like this, which kind of negotiated the cultural struggles between country folk and city people. It wasn't until the 70s that sitcoms came to engage with themes that were more diverse and liberal, and this was called a turn to relevance. So we saw shows like All in the Family, Mary Tyler Moore, The Jeffersons, and these were negotiating much more with the youth that had come out of this 60s counterculture in the decade before. And I'll talk more about that later on. Into the 80s, a lot of shows, of course, took on a very neoliberal discourse. So a lot of the work on sitcoms in the 80s really talks about The Cosby Show, and we could talk about The Cosby Show or, Cosby, but I'm going to focus on its neoliberal discourse. So the Cosby Show was quite novel because it depicted an upper class African American family, but in doing so, it didn't at all speak to the conditions of poverty or racism that Black Americans were actually experiencing at the time. And Cosby kind of reinforced this Reaganist ethos that through individual effort, Black Americans could make it on their own and they didn't need any additional help from the government. So the 90s brought a lot of sitcoms about these urban, youthful characters in shows like the Seinfeld, The Nanny, Friends, and a lot of these shows, interestingly, depict Jewish characters. We see Jewish characters again in Will and Grace, and this show, along with Ellen, also depicts gay and lesbian representations. And there was a lot more shows about women, notably Sex and the City in this decade. So at this time, traditional broadcast was losing a lot of its audience to niche cable. Viewers became interested in more diverse representation on screen. So the major networks, to try and combat this and their strategy to keep their viewers, strangely enough, was to use Jewish characters, gay and lesbian characters, and women to satisfy this want for diversity. But at the same time, this was actually playing it quite safe because all of these people, despite being diverse in individual ways, are still notably white and middle class. There was a lot of Black theme programming at this time, but it was almost exclusively on BET, a cable network, or the weaker broadcast network, Fox. So effectively, these racially diverse representations were ghettoized from these major broadcasters. So in television production studies, I basically assume the history of television that I outlined in my first field, but here I really focus in on production processes and the experiences of television industry workers. So for me, production studies provide a way of understanding how production processes and practices not only shape television text, meaning what we see on screen, but how the shows we watch in turn reflect these larger relationships of power in society. So a big issue for television industry workers is that work has become increasingly precarious, meaning part-time, freelance, contract work under neoliberalism. Especially in this industry, workers engage with self-exploitation, meaning that they're extremely flexible with their hours. They take pay, maybe an unpaid internship that doesn't cover the work that they're actually doing. They engage in dangerous labor a lot of the time. And this is because people in this industry are so enamored with the prestige and creative rewards of being in the industry that they're willing to do this. There's also a lot of different issues of identity in production communities. So because I'm focusing on the sitcom, I looked at the writer's room. So the sitcom or any television comedy is also done by a team of writers where writers are freely throwing around ideas. And this kind of humor is often generated on social categories like race, gender, ethnicity, sexuality. So even if individual writers in the room are offended, it's a precarious work environment. They have to come off as easy to work with in order to be hired back. So often instead of speaking up, people laugh along. And in this way, diverse points of view are silenced. Now, roles that are more craft or technical based are often always gendered as well. So more artistic departments like costume design or hair and makeup are often feminized, while more technical roles like lighting design or camera operation are masculinized, regardless of who actually fills these positions. So a lot of production processes in American television are guided by notions that production workers hold about their audiences. So here I really looked at the work of Dallas Smythe, who first articulated this theory of the audience commodity. Basically, audiences are the commodity or product dealt with in markets, and advertisers buy access to the audience's attention from networks. So television programs merely act as the bait to lure these audiences in to hold their attention to watch ads. There's companies in the US like Nielsen Ratings who specialize in audience measurements. So they work to assure advertisers that they are actually accessing the audience segments that they're paying for. And to this body of work, Eileen Meehan adds an important feminist perspective. So Meehan highlights that these rating systems like Nielsen produce audience measurements that have always been highly constructed. So essentially, they really have only historically sampled the households that have the funds, desire, and access to purchase non-essential consumer goods. So basically, anyone who has no power as a consumer is unimportant in the television audience. Looking back to history not that long ago, patriarchal divisions of labor have traditionally assumed that men earn wages outside the home, and for some reason that makes them in control of all the spending, while women simply are in the home completing domestic labor. So men have always been treated as the consumers and the audience, while women have historically been marginalized to a special niche audience during daytime. Women wouldn't be considered as part of the audience really until the 70s, when second wave feminism brought many white middle-class women into the public sphere, and advertisers began to view them specifically as in control of their own income. So as cable grew in the 80s, it was this white, upscale, working woman aged 18 to 34 who was really among one of the first niche groups of interest to cable television. Women have always been considered a niche audience rather than the audience, yet we make up 50% of the population, so we're pretty economically sensible to target by that logic. So there's tons of different strategies that executives engage with to help guide their decision making about what is aired and when it is aired, but I just wanted to highlight one key case study. So in the 60s, CBS had disproportionately served this really older rural audience who lived in the Midwest, basically, with programming like the Beverly Hillbillies or Petticoat Junction. And these shows did really well in the ratings, but they didn't score well at CBS's owned and operated stations, which were in urban markets like New York, Chicago, LA, Philadelphia. And these owned and operated stations are extremely important for overall network profits. At the same time, advertisers were beginning to care about a much younger urban and liberal demographic because they were really the ones who had the disposable income to spend on consumer goods. So CBS completely overhauled its strategy accordingly. In the early 70s, they wanted to attract this new, young, urban demographic who happened to live in their key markets. And they did this using relevant TV. So we saw sitcoms like Mary Tyler Moore, Jefferson, Maude, and many others. And these shows were socially engaged, and a lot of them also presented ethnic and racial depictions that hadn't been seen on the sitcom since very early television. Now, once cable arrived in the 80s, this assumed mass audience was even further splintered by programming catering to these niche audience tastes. As I mentioned, there was a rise in women's cable networks and programming. So Lifetime first emerged in 1984, followed by Women's Entertainment, TLC, HGTV. The list goes on. And ironically, all of these niche cable channels target the exact same 18 to 34-year-old college-educated woman who has a middle class to upscale household income. So the female audience is actually a pretty uniform one. Now, the arrival of niche cable, in a sense, did bring more racially diverse programming. But like I said, this diversity was really only happening on these niche cable channels while the major broadcasters remained pretty white. But more recently, we've seen an increase in diversity both on screen and behind the camera, particularly on premium cable like HBO or streaming services. So we've seen shows like Insecure or Atlanta like this. So these shows in a way do respond to audiences of color, but actually they appeal to the white liberal consumers because it's the relatively affluent, educated, and left-leaning audiences who are imagined to pay for subscriptions to these costly services. And this demographic is notably white. So here, unfortunately, this diversity is used to attract these consumers, and it doesn't actually reflect a shift in the imagining of the audience, which remains as white and middle to upper class as ever. So I briefly want to discuss some of the aesthetics of the sitcom and how this has shifted to attract this audience that I just spoke about. So what we know as the multicam sitcom originated on the set of I Love Lucy. So it's shot on a soundstage. You usually have 3 sets in a row, a live audience sitting in bleachers that run past each, a large lighting grid over above, and about 3 cameras that are capturing this action simultaneously as scenes are acted out from start to finish. So this is supposed to mimic the experience of a theater. So it's supposed to create the illusion for at-home audiences that they're sharing in some kind of a live event. There's a lot of limitations to this because within the studio, you only have 3 sets. So often these storylines take place in established domestic settings like the living room or the kitchen or the office, and these kinds of settings we just see over and over and over again. By the new millennium, the sitcom had really become excessively stylized and visual. So this was a turn to a single camera mode of production. So instead of theater, this mimicked the style of cinema. So here we see humor generated not only through the acting and the strong dialogue, but also through production techniques like camera angles, framing, sound effects, lighting, and so on. So here in this mode of production, you have a single camera that's recording every scene on a shot-by-shot basis. Then it's heavily assembled and edited in post-production. These are not tethered to any kind of studio or live audience. So the opportunity for story and tone and setting is much greater. So shows like this that we can think of are The Office or Arrested Development or Curb Your Enthusiasm that experiment with a lot of absurd visual jokes. There's flashbacks, montages, voiceover narration, and recurring sound or music gags. So this consciousness of style is necessary in this increasingly narrow cast competitive industry. So these programs have to adopt these identifiable markers of style in order to attract this quality audience. So we see this especially on premium cable and streaming services, how this kind of excessive stylization is just accelerated in order for them to say they're offering high-end, highly original content that attracts viewers who are not only able but willing to pay for their costly subscriptions. So I'm now going to talk about post-feminism. So since its appearance in the 80s, there have been 4 approaches to delineate what is meant by post-feminism, and each of them are really reacting to shifts seen since the height of the second wave feminist movement in the 70s. So quite simply, post-feminism can be seen as a historical shift, suggesting the pastness of the height of second wave feminism. It can also be seen, particularly in the 80s, as a backlash against feminism. For many at this time, women's lib was a mistake and the source of great societal unhappiness. It also signaled an epistemological break within feminism. So it implies a change within feminism that marks its intersection with a lot of other anti-foundationalist movements like postmodernism, postcolonialism, poststructuralism, these kinds of things. The approach that I focus on, and the one which I take up in my own work, is post-feminism as a sensibility. So by the 90s, second wave feminist values had been taken on board within a huge range of societal and public institutions. So post-feminism positively recognizes and draws on these gains to suggest that women have won this battle for equality and feminism is really no longer needed. Feminism in the 90s appeared as out of date, untrendy for older women. So in this sense, feminism was taken into account and simultaneously repudiated. And in this context, post-feminism emerged as really a taken for granted sensibility. It was largely created, expressed, circulated, and received through popular culture. It emphasizes female individualism, which is, of course, a product of neoliberalism. So here, the ability to support oneself and earn a living without any kind of extra social support becomes primarily important. Young women are pushed towards self-reliance, and these discourses of empowerment and choice replace truly feminist politics. This emphasis on choice then expresses itself in consumer culture. So young women are endowed with this social and economic capacity, but they're expected to participate in the workforce. As they work, they control their own income, and this permits them full immersion in consumer culture and the choice to show off what they've earned through their consumption. So women come to be constructed as subjects to the extent that they're able to consume. And this in turn creates this kind of scary celebratory equivalency between consumerism and empowerment. So through consumerism, we see this huge revitalization at this time of feminine beauty and fashion culture. And women essentially are presenting their self-adorned bodies as a source of power. So in this way, there's this freedom to independently earn wages and participate in consumer culture that's promised to young women, especially in the 90s and moving forward, in exchange for an abandonment of feminism and feminist politics. So in this way, post-feminism is really working to undo feminism. Now, out of this sensibility arose popular feminism in the 2010s. So while post-feminism repudiated feminism, popular feminism made feminism suddenly acceptable, visible, popular in popular culture. But both feminisms actually depend on and validate this neoliberal capitalist ethos. So popular feminism recognizes gender inequalities, but it almost always proposes neoliberal solutions to these. We see feminism highly circulated in the media, and this is driven by profit and not for a truly feminist critique. So here, becoming visible does not guarantee that power relations are deeply challenged or transformed, and neither post-feminism or popular feminism really offers a critique of the hierarchies of gender, race, class, and more that are re-articulated by neoliberalism, and instead they just re-entrench a neoliberal rationality. So a lot of scholars who work on post-feminism have noted its limited vision of identity. It tends to center on white, middle-class, heterosexual Western women and kind of cast everyone else aside. So for McRobbie, this limits the possibility for various social progressive movements, including feminism, anti-racism, LGBTQ+ rights, and more to come together and forge alliances. So in other words, post-feminism or popular feminism are not intersectional. Other scholars do interrogate the way that these include a diversity of subjects while still reaffirming this white heterosexual subject. So we have to kind of interrogate the way that all subjects might adopt, internalize, and negotiate post-feminist conceptions of race, gender, or sexuality. And just as post-feminism makes feminism consumable, it also does this with race in a way. So it kind of makes race as a product for women to try on or buy, such as hip hop culture or these creepy dolls. And here, this visibility in popular culture is not actually bringing any kind of true political critique or empowerment. So just as post-feminism is produced, circulated, and received in popular culture, I want to quickly discuss some sitcoms that shed light on post-feminism in this regard. By using feminist television criticism, we can uncover how television or post-feminism, what these mean for certain times. through analyzing these texts. So feminism first really appeared on the sitcom in the 1970s as this new woman type. She was single, glamorous, middle class, someone who chose a career made possible by second wave feminism, and someone who chooses to live independently over being married and having children. So Mary Richards of the Mary Tyler Moore Show is really the prototype of this. But ultimately, Mary's feminism is less about politics and social transformation as it is about presenting feminism as this glamorous lifestyle choice available for women to choose. There was a lot of sitcoms in the 80s that negotiated this contradiction of an emerging post-feminism. But I want to focus on the 90s, where we saw these female characters who are appearing as fully post-feminist. They are successful, they are powerful, they are fabulous, they are fashionable. And this is really a return in a way to Mary Tyler Moore's lifestyle feminism. So we see the women of HBO Sex and the City, for example. There's a lot of positive stuff going on in that show, but largely they're sidestepping political issues in favor of showing off their consumption and their sexual freedom. Now, into the 2010s, a lot of sitcoms were engaging with the popular feminisms. So we see this with the women of the show Girls or Broad City. These women are sex positive, they're very complex, and these shows were a departure from previous focuses on consumerism and individualism, especially because they're depicting these really intimate and loyal female friendships. So while these shows are very progressive in this sense, the characters on them all are really benefiting from a middle class whiteness. So again, they're not intersectional and they're not heavily critiquing neoliberalism. So after exploring all these fields, I found that they share key connections around this imagining of the female audience. So each of these fields is really contributing to an understanding of the ways that television has come to target this first liberated female in the 70s and then later post-feminist demographic. So I found that these inclusions and exclusions of representation on screen have always been calculated in pursuit of appealing to particular demographics in order to really reap maximum advertising profit. So from the outset, of course, television has always been a commercial medium. It's always been centered around advertising. And most of the developments of the medium have been designed specifically to maximize advertising profit in this way. In turn, production practices are influenced by the pursuit of this. So a lot of them are guided by this imagined audience. We saw the shift from multicam to single cam productions to do this, as well as a lot of shows being produced to specifically appeal to particular demographics of consumer groups. So we saw how women came to be valued as audience members only once they were perceived as earning economic subjects in control of their own income. And with this came the emergence of lots of different women's cable networks, female-oriented programming, all of which presented this ultimate post-feminist woman living independently and highly entrenched in consumer culture. So this content, of course, targets a post-feminist audience. This audience becomes visible as empowered subjects only to the extent that they are able to consume. So factors of gender and identity do greatly influence any media organization's decisions. So on-screen ethnic, racial, and feminist depictions are included on screen strategically insofar as the audiences to whom they are imagined to appeal to hold power as consumers. These representations rarely contribute true political critique, but instead are just working to appeal to an imagined audience that is left-leaning, urban, middle class, and white, unfortunately. So that concludes my presentation.
Thank you. I have never known so much about television. That was so interesting. So we have time for taking questions. Those of you on Zoom, you can put questions in the chat or raise your Zoom hand. We can call on you. And if anyone in the room would like to ask a question, now is your chance. Go ahead.
I guess it would help. I want the best context for what would be most helpful for you. So what would you be interested? What kind of feedback would be helpful to you? Are you looking for comments or questions? Is this a project you're still developing?
So this was my field exam. So I completed this
Okay.
in September, but a lot of these themes and a lot of the historical work I've been doing, I will use for my dissertation.
Okay. Okay, that helps just to give me some context for thinking about all of this stuff. Okay, so one of the things that occurs to me is that cable television, of course, is not funded by advertising, right? It's funded by subscription. So when we're looking at things like Sex and the City or Girls or some of the more modern representations that you're talking about, I think maybe we can problematize that a little bit. Like for sure, there's a huge message of consumerism that comes out of a show like Sex and the City, but the representation and inclusion in that show isn't directly related to the idea of the audience commodity or the old school. They used to call it the LOP, the least objectionable programming. So I'm wondering if you have some ideas about how to think through the way that the funding model shifts.
Yeah, and this is a problem too. Certainly as we see things like streamers introduced, right? It's a very similar problem, but I kind of view the model of premium cable like HBO, Showtime, stuff like that, similar to the streaming model, because they're all trying to appeal to these people who are able to pay for these costly subscriptions. And you're right, they're not putting advertising in the actual content. So yeah, it does complicate this initial audience commodity theory for sure, which is based on measuring audiences to be able to target them with advertising. I haven't been able to really read anything that updates that theory because it's quite old at this point. It's from the late 70s. So that is very helpful feedback, because now I'm gonna go try and find stuff that updates that for streamers and premium cable. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, this is a walk down memory lane, so bless your heart. You're so great. And I know that's not probably not for you, it's a discovery. I love the title about imagining female audience, because it has to be imagined. You don't have a hotline to the truth of who the female audience is. And so these are people guessing and convincing each other that they know something out there. And Todd Gitlin in Inside Prime Time wrote, he called it the problem of knowing. He had a nice kind of gloss on that thing, that all these folks, they throw the ratings numbers around, but they're actually, they're just engaged in a mutual construction of something that's workable enough to convince the advertisers to keep sending them money. And so, yeah, how do you theorize that process? Because it's actually really weird. You can get executives in the room to say, yeah, I know I'm buying and selling measurement error.
Yeah.
But if I said that out loud, I wouldn't get through the next, I wouldn't have a job. So I'm not, it's like they just live with it. And do you have a kind of way of thinking through it? It actually might be relevant to these questions about how do you understand what's going on with streamers, because there's a lot of guesswork there. I mean, when HBO started doing they had no idea who was watching or how they were going to pay for stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it's still like Netflix. Nobody knows what, where the money is coming from and where it's going to go and all that. So there's still this huge amount of guesswork, but it's, I'm just saying this in a kind of common sense way, like as a scholar, how do you make sense of that? that piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that there is any way of ever actually knowing who the audience is. Well, there
Right.
isn't, right? But I know it's frustrating. That's why it's kind of like, for being more about figuring out who they're imagining is watching, because we can't ever really know who's actually watching. And I love that old thought where, you know, the TV's on, but half the time it's just someone's dog watching, right?
Yeah, kind of building on what Tom was saying, I think maybe one of the interesting things could be to take a look at who the advertisers wanted to talk to, right? And because, I mean, the thing is that when you're in advertising, you don't actually give a shit who you're talking to, right? You're talking to an archetype, you're talking to a stereotype, right? Especially when we're talking about television. We're not talking about you, visual, we're talking about you as a type, right? And so, like, it could be interesting to sort of take a look at how the networks were shaping this character, this imagined character that they're selling to the advertisers, right? Because they don't actually give shit who's watching. They just, like, they want to get close enough.
Mhm.
There needs to be some element of resonance.
Yeah.
I think though, this is where the role of authorship becomes more important, because if we're talking about an era where there was literally sponsored, like Philip Morris used to own I Love Lucy, you know, like where the advertisers would decide what the content was. And obviously, yes, it's about least objectionable programming and highest ratings and biggest market share. And so the content, you just kind of get lucky. Like, there is an episode actually of All in the Family called Gloria Discovers Women's Lib. And it's like a beautiful little thing of Gloria trying to explain to her mother how she's had these things and she resists Archie and his bad ways. But it's also problematic because she's kind of represented as a little bit hysterical. And so that relevancy comedy era did have a whole bunch of threads through that tried to imagine an audience yearning for deeper ideological messages. But if ultimately the networks are at the behest of the advertisers, that's very different now than, like, coming back to premium cable and streamers, where the authorship is a huge component now of, like, someone's vision. And especially in the context of American television, where, like, we're talking about the writer's room of 22 episodes a season and this collaborative effort where nobody really has a vision. It's very different from the British model. But premium cable, which maybe only has 10 episodes or 8, that authorial voice is much stronger. So the question is, like, who decides who's actually speaking to the audience? It's not advertisers anymore, it's someone else. And I think that there's a shift, like there's a clear point where that shift happens.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is something that's interesting and important to unpack as well.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of work on HBO really kind of crafting this idea of the television auteur, which is, of course, the French film theory. So around the 80s is when you started to see people like David Lynch. They started to use that as a marketing tool, really. So they started to kind of abandon this idea that television was anonymous in a sense, and that it was written by a team, and that television was now becoming the work of a single genius who was imposing their artistic vision on it. And that really has especially now come to be used as a marketing tool for cable channels like FX, premium cable like HBO, Netflix, to attract these people who are able to pay for those services to them and make them feel like they're getting something that's more special than those Chuck Lorre sitcoms that you see on CBS with a laugh track that, you know, are pretty low level. They're pretty annoying, not gonna lie. I went to a live taping of a Chuck Lorre sitcom in LA, and I think I have PTSD from that experience still, from having to laugh. Yeah.
Did they have any popular like a factor or something? Or-
No, there was an audience warmer there for the whole 6 hours, throwing candy and swag at you if you would get up and dance and stuff while they were in between takes. And it's like, I'm just hungry and I want to go to the bathroom, and you're not allowed to leave the whole time. And they take away your phone and your bag and everything. Like, it's this weird, very creepy place that I never want to go back to. Any other questions?
I want to ask sort of an impossible question, although it's solicited by something that you say at the close, Avery, which is the difference between ideological reproduction and profit maximization, whether through advertising and streaming, and true political critique. That's a pretty fair distinction. You've got this over here and then this over here, which makes me want to ask what the this over here, the true political critique is.
Yeah.
If we struggle to make that absolute distinction, what does, if not the messy middle, what does the complicated middle look like? So first of all, what would be true political critique? And
Right.
what part of what raises the question for me is, I watched, I don't know, proud, ashamed, horrified. It's just true to say, Mary Tyler Moore in first run with my mother. I was a teenager in the preteen, watched with my mother, and it did mean something, even though it was what you're claiming about it was true. It also makes me wonder what draws you to Jewish sitcom representation, and what holds you. And so is there something about the draw, the hold, it meaning something that asks us to undertake that space between the reproduction and profit optimization on the one hand and true political critique on the other? So question one is, what for you is true political critique? And what do you do with this experiential layering?
Well, I think everyone in this room can probably think of an example when they were watching television and they saw something that spoke to them politically and maybe changed their minds about something, right? Like, it's not all white and black in that sense. There are many different interpretations that can be taken from anything on television, really. But I guess what I'm meaning by that is it's much different than what we're doing, say, in the academy, where we're producing work with the intent of social change and to investigate things, whereas what we see on the sitcoms aren't fully produced for that purpose. They are produced with the goal of earning money, and they're always kind of mediated by whatever these political economic logics are, so that whatever they're presenting on the sitcom isn't gonna change people's minds enough to turn them against the major political economic rationalities of that society. To answer the part about the Jewish women on the sitcoms, I'm a Jewish woman, and kind of looking into this stuff, I've noticed these really strange and large gaps in the representation of Jewish women on the sitcom. So in very early television, the Goldbergs, of course, it was a very ethnic Jewish show. They spoke a lot of Yiddish on that. They had heavy accents. They were really entrenched in this way of life. And then after their cancellation, there was no Jewish woman on the sitcom until Rhoda in the 70s. So that was almost a 15-year gap where there was no Jewish women on TV. So Rhoda was a character on Mary Tyler Moore, and then got her own show, Rhoda. And when Rhoda went off air at the end of the 70s, again, we didn't see any Jewish women on the sitcom until the 90s. So there's these huge gaps. So I kind of want to understand, why are there these big gaps? What do they mean when they appear? And I also noticed that between Rhoda and then the characters who are appearing in this post-feminist landscape of the 90s, whenever these ethnic Jewish women appear, they're always highly embodying the feminism of their time. So for Rhoda, second wave feminism, and then in the characters of the nanny, of the 90s, like the nanny, Will and Grace, the women on Friends, and more, they're highly post-feminist. So I kind of am wanting to see what is this entanglement and why do we see these gaps, and then why, when they appear, are they both ethnic and seemingly liberated women of their time. So a lot of that is tying into these kinds of questions of the imagined audience. Who are these representations being produced to appeal to, that kind of thing.
Sounds like Jewish women are floating signifiers, and then there's something, they stand for different things. Thank you.
So my mind is going to algorithm. And because of the way that people are talking about streaming services and how we don't know who's watching or purchasing these and how they're differently put into competition. Other now, you can just, if you have a $15 budget, you can still select one. That's like for, like so many of us do that, right? And so they don't necessarily know who we are as people, but they are absolutely building profiles about us.
Yeah.
And then doing whatever they do, gearing their product for their imagined audience. And it's a different kind of imagined audience that's produced by these like sort of predictive statistical models that are algorithmic cultures. And then so what struck me is the way that the Nielsen rating, so it's a version of that, right? So there's an early, that's if it's imagining that there's this category of people that we want to know about, and those are the ones we're going to count in this, basically what is an algorithm. I feel like there's a really interesting connection there, and I have no idea if it's useful to you in your project or if that's sort of outside of it, but I feel like what we're seeing here is an early algorithmic culture already, like at the beginning.
Yeah,
That's all I don't have a question. But just other than like, what would that be useful?
yeah, that had never occurred, but it's very interesting to think about. And now I'm gonna go down a rabbit hole.
Well, there's a book that either just came out or is about to come out that tries to write about that transition from ratings to algorithm.
Yeah.
And it's sloppy on both ends, but it's, I mean, not the book, it's not like algorithms got the hot smoking truth that the ratings couldn't get at. It's like there's still massive amounts of guesswork going on.
Yeah,
I mean, and so email me if I don't email you with the name of that book. It's by a young scholar. I'll try to remember it, but it's yeah, it might be helpful for exactly that question.
Yeah.
One last point then, because it just occurred to me when you were talking about algorithms. Like we're now in this period too where viewing has become ahistorical. Like I noticed that Ally McBeal has just showed up on Disney Plus, right? She's 25 years old, but there are people who are going to not understand the context in which that first appeared, and it's largely hailed as big post-feminist text.
Yeah.
And I think that same relationship, like I wonder if it's worth also thinking about the secondary audience that is being imagined when these shows show up again on streaming services. Exactly. And that exactly. So I think that's really, and the other thing that occurred to me, Daryl Hamamoto, I think he wrote a book called Nervous Laughter, and he makes a comment about how sitcoms do the work of ideological smuggling. So it's like partly about what they're allowed to do because they're comic. So it's about the way ideology can be brought on board, because of course the primary objective is to make money and to increase ratings, but that sometimes you can do the two things at the same time and be quite committed actually to both.
Yeah, because it's always engaging with these maybe countercultural, counter hegemonic or countercultural themes, through the guise of play, right? So people are not going to be as offended as if they were presented seriously and straight.
All right. I was gonna add something, but I'm not familiar with this field, but I was gonna say, I wonder if you would gain some insight from looking, when you're looking at the streaming side of things, some insight into how they fail at imagining the correct audience when there's like a canceled show, and then,
Yeah,
you know, the internet explodes in anger and they have to like pull it back on or find a way to make it work because they were wrong about who was watching the show and how people were engaging with it.
yeah,
Mine and Daryl's Beloved show got canceled, so it was on my mind as we were talking about streaming services, but that could be a good, or I would assume it could be an interesting way to see the failures at like imagining the audience, like the correct audience. Anyone else? All right, well, thank you, Avery. Another round of applause. A reminder that our next mediations session is in 2 weeks on October 27th at 4:30 in this room or on Zoom, and it's going to be a talk by Edward Spiridenko titled "Poisoning of Alexei Navalny: Understanding Counter Propaganda." Excuse me. All right, thanks everyone.
thanks everyone.
Thanks, Avery.
This is